The sky was thick with black smoke, rising like a funeral shroud over our once quiet suburban neighborhood. Flames licked the edges of the small wooden shed at the corner of our backyard, their orange tongues dancing against the daylight, like they belonged to hell itself. People stood frozen, neighbors in slippers and sweatpants clutching mugs and phones, whispering, gawking, recording, but not moving. The sirens wailed louder now, slicing through the suffocating silence, but it felt too late. I was running, barefoot, screaming, my throat raw and heart pounding, crashing past the crowd as if I could tear the fire down with my hands. Get her out. My daughter's in there. I screamed so loud I could feel my voice breaking inside my chest, but they didn't believe me. A man from the HOA, clipboard still in hand, shook his head. No one's in there, ma'am. Karen said it's empty. Calm down. Karen. Her name was acid on my tongue, but there was no time for rage, only for saving my little girl. I lunged toward the shed, but two neighbors held me back as the heat cracked through the wood. The firefighters had just arrived, shouting, dragging hoses, but still, no one moved toward the locked shed. That's when someone finally yelled, "There's a child inside." A voice, uncertain, shaky, but real. One of the kids, maybe. A bystander dropped his phone. I broke free and charged forward before anyone could stop me. The shed door wouldn't budge. I threw myself at it again and again, fists bleeding, knuckles raw, until it gave way with a splintering scream of its own. The smoke poured out like a monster, and through it I saw her, curled on the floor, unmoving, her small arms shielding her face. My baby, my sweet, disabled daughter. I pulled her out with every ounce of strength I had, gasping and sobbing, collapsing onto the scorched grass as the paramedics swarmed around us. She was alive, barely, her body limp, face ash gray, eyes fluttering but not focusing. They took her, and I stayed there on the ground, my hands shaking with shock and fury. Then I heard it, calm, cruel, and unforgivable. Karen's voice behind me, arms folded, lips barely moving. Well, that's one less burden for the neighborhood. The world went still. That child, the one they left behind in a burning shed, that child was my daughter. And HOA Karen made sure she stayed inside. We moved into the neighborhood that spring, not for luxury or status, but for something far more fragile and rare, peace. After years of renting rundown apartments on loud streets, this modest house, with its pale blue shutters and wraparound porch, felt like a blessing. For the first time in years, I could breathe. My daughter, Layla, needed that peace even more than I did. She was only 9, but her body carried 1,000 silent battles. Cerebral palsy had left her legs too weak to walk unassisted, and her speech came in melodic fragments, like poetry the world never slowed down enough to hear. But her smile, that was pure light. It lit up strangers' faces in grocery stores, made nurses laugh during hospital visits, and gave me strength on nights when I couldn't afford to fall apart. We'd chosen this home specifically because the backyard had space for therapy swings, and the neighborhood was advertised as family-friendly. I imagined bike rides, chalk drawings, and birthday parties. I imagined kindness. What I didn't imagine was the homeowners association, or more specifically, the woman who ran it. Her name was Karen Whitmore, mid-50s, always in heels too sharp for lawn grass, lips too thin to smile, and an expression that made you feel like you'd already broken a rule you didn't know existed. We met her the day after we moved in. I was helping Layla down the front steps, her walker wobbling as she carefully placed her feet, when Karen appeared unannounced on our porch, clipboard in hand. No hello, no welcome, just a cool glance at our new flower pots, and then, per HOA guidelines, all porch decor must be uniform and pre-approved. These pots are not neutral colors. She said neutral like it was holy scripture. I blinked. We just moved in yesterday. I was going to check the handbook. Karen interrupted. I'm sure you were. Let's not make it a habit. She glanced at Layla, gave a tight-lipped nod, and turned. That was our introduction. At first, I tried to laugh it off. Every community has a few uptight folks, right? But Karen wasn't just uptight. She was everywhere. She'd show up at 7 a.m. to measure grass length with a tape measure. She took photos of trash bins that weren't pulled in by 9 a.m. She once fined a family because their toddler's inflatable pool was visible from the road. People whispered about her at the mailbox, but never confronted her. HOA meetings were silent, fearful affairs. No one challenged her. But I wasn't trying to challenge anyone. I just wanted a safe space for Layla to grow. Layla adored the backyard. It became her little kingdom. We installed soft mats beneath her swings, raised her garden beds so she could reach them from her chair, and added solar lights that twinkled like fairy dust at night. Neighbors often commented on how lovely it looked, but Karen saw it differently. To her, it was non-compliant outdoor equipment. Within 2 weeks, I received our first warning letter, then another, then a formal notice to remove all special accommodations that alter the uniformity of the neighborhood aesthetic. I tried to reason with her. I explained that the swings weren't permanent fixtures, that the ramp we installed to help Layla enter the home wasn't an eyesore, it was her freedom. Karen responded with a smile, so tight it looked painful, and said, "We all have burdens, but burdens don't exempt us from community standards." That word, burdens, she said it like my child was an inconvenience, like our presence threatened her perfectly manicured vision of suburbia. It stung, but I didn't push back, not then. Because every mom of a disabled child learns the subtle art of choosing battles. We're taught to endure, to adapt, to be grateful for crumbs of accommodation. Still, the signs kept coming. A $50 fine for Layla's mobility scooter blocking the sidewalk even though it was parked beside our garage. A notice demanding we repaint our accessible handrail to match the house trim. Karen even suggested we consider putting up a privacy fence so the therapeutic visuals wouldn't disturb the neighborhood's uniformity. But Layla never noticed the tension. She waved at Karen every time she saw her, her little hand flapping excitedly. Once, she even called out, "Hi, Miss Karen," from her swing. Karen didn't wave back. I wanted to believe it would end there. That Karen would tire of us. That if I stayed quiet long enough, followed every ridiculous rule, and didn't cause trouble, we'd be left alone. But I was wrong. Because Karen didn't just dislike rules being broken, she hated anything that reminded her the world wasn't perfect. And my daughter, in her innocence and joy and need for compassion, shattered the illusion Karen had built around her flawless little HOA kingdom. And when Karen couldn't control us through letters or fines, she found another way, and it nearly cost my daughter her life. Karen Whitmore wasn't just the head of our HOA, she was its queen, judge, and executioner all in one sharply dressed package. Picture the kind of woman who'd knock on your door not to welcome you, but to inform you that your mailbox paint was 2 shades too cheerful. Mid-50s, always immaculately dressed in pressed pastels or beige pantsuits, heels clicking like a metronome of control, and a hairstyle that hadn't moved since 1994. To outsiders, she was graceful, polite, even elegant, the kind of woman who hosted charity brunches, smiled in every community newsletter photo, and handed out Halloween candy with white gloves, but only to children dressed appropriately. To the rest of us, however, Karen was a tyrant in pearls. Her charm was as real as plastic fruit. It looked good from a distance, but try biting into it and you'd break your teeth. HOA meetings became theater under her reign. She spoke with a calm, authoritative tone that sounded like diplomacy, but landed like dictatorship. I believe in structure, she'd often say, with the kind of smile that meant my way or the highway. And in her world, structure meant eliminating anything or anyone that disrupted her perfect picture of suburban normalcy. Karen didn't run the HOA board. She was the board. Yes, there were technically other members, but they acted more like stage props than decision makers. If Karen raised her eyebrow, motions passed. If she tilted her head, discussions ended. She ran the neighborhood with the precision of a general and the warmth of a refrigerator. Even longtime residents walked on eggshells. One family repainted their entire house after she left a note taped to their garage. Another swapped out their rose bushes for hydrangeas because Karen claimed the color palette clashed with the seasonal tone. No one argued, not because they agreed, but because they knew better. But what made Karen truly dangerous wasn't her authority. It was her ability to manipulate perception. She was a master of appearances. Around others, she spoke in careful tones, always with plausible deniability. She never said outright that your kids' toys were unsightly. She'd simply note how some residents have expressed concern about visual clutter. She never admitted to targeting families. She'd just mention how certain homes don't seem to be adhering to community standards. She wielded the rule book like a weapon, and her smile like camouflage. When we moved in, Karen made up her mind about us in an instant. And when she saw Layla, my daughter, in her walker, smiling as she played with her dolls in the yard, I saw it. That flicker, that momentary twist of her lips, almost imperceptible, like a glitch in her composure. To Karen, Layla didn't belong in her perfectly curated kingdom. A disabled child didn't fit the brochure image. She was, in Karen's eyes, a disruption, a burden not worth the effort to accommodate, just an inconvenience to eliminate. She never said it aloud, of course. That wasn't her style. Instead, she filed complaints, sent letters, dropped warnings in our mailbox like paper grenades. She claimed the therapy swing posed a liability risk, that the wheelchair ramp was aesthetic pollution, that Layla's laughter, sweet and high-pitched, could be considered a noise disturbance. On paper, it was always about compliance. But everyone who lived there long enough knew the truth. Karen didn't want reminders that the world wasn't perfect. She hated what she couldn't control. And Layla, with her spirit and sparkle and visible difference, was the one thing Karen couldn't fit into a rulebook. And yet, despite all this, many neighbors still admired her. Not because they liked her, but because they were afraid of her. She could make your life miserable with a single letter. She could fine you for leaving your garbage can out an hour too late. She once threatened a man with legal escalation for hanging wind chimes that were, in her words, too whimsical. People nodded when she spoke, agreed when she barked, and disappeared behind closed doors the moment she walked by. And when she smiled, that tight-lipped, cold smile, they smiled back. Because in Karen's world, silence was safety. To the neighborhood, she was the reason the lawns stayed green, the streets clean, the mailboxes matching. To me, she was the reason I kept waking up at 3 a.m., wondering how to keep my daughter safe. To Layla, she was just Miss Karen, the lady who never waved back. But I knew better. Because behind that polished exterior and clipboard was a woman who didn't just enforce rules, she wrote them to destroy what she didn't understand. And when she couldn't erase us with letters or meetings or codes, she lit a match. It started with a yellow notice taped to our front door, a friendly reminder from the HOA. The kind of thing you get for leaving your recycling bin out overnight or planting roses instead of boxwood shrubs. But this wasn't about bins or flowers. It was about the ramp, the small, unobtrusive wooden ramp we had installed so that my daughter Layla could safely enter our home in her wheelchair. The notice said it violated the Uniform Exterior Modifications Policy and that we had 7 days to remove it or face daily fines. I stood there for a minute staring at the paper like it was written in another language. How could a wheelchair ramp, something that allowed my disabled child basic access to her home, be considered a violation? My hands trembled as I folded the notice, already knowing who was behind it. I emailed the HOA immediately. I explained how necessary the ramp was, attached Layla's disability documentation, included a doctor's note. I cited the Americans with Disabilities Act. I pleaded. And when I got a reply, it wasn't from a board, it was from Karen. Her message was short and formal. All exterior modifications must go through the HOA approval process. Unfortunately, no such approval was sought or granted. Personal medical circumstances, while unfortunate, do not exempt residents from compliance. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, HOA Chair. Unfortunate. That's what she called it. As if Layla's condition was a minor inconvenience rather than a daily, lifelong struggle. I felt a fire grow in my chest. I responded again, this time with more urgency, more emotion. She didn't reply. Instead, 2 days later, a second notice appeared. A $150 fine, the first of what would become a steady stream of paper threats. Then came the issue with the mobility scooter. Layla's therapist had suggested it to help her grow more independent, to feel like she could explore, play, live. We parked it neatly beside our garage. It wasn't blocking anything, wasn't even in view from the street, unless you stood at just the right angle and squinted. But that didn't matter to Karen. Another violation. Another fine. This time labeled as equipment storage in public view. I pointed out that several residents had bicycles, scooters, and tools outside their homes. Karen replied with a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, certain sections underlined in red, none of which actually applied. Then came the noise complaints. At first, I thought it was a mistake. What noise? We weren't loud people. We didn't host parties. But then I read the complaint. Repeated disruptive vocalizations during early evening hours. That was Layla. Laughing. Playing. Her joy. Her voice. My daughter's laughter was now considered disruptive. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I confronted Karen directly at the monthly HOA meeting. I waded through the agenda past the lawn care updates and mailbox design votes until it was finally time for open comments. I stood, shaking, holding the notices in my hand. I spoke calmly but firmly. I explained Layla's condition, our rights, the unfair targeting, the cruelty of it all. For a moment, the room was silent. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One woman gave me a sympathetic look, but then Karen stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get angry. She didn't even look at me. Instead, she turned to the rest of the room and said, "We are not here to make exceptions for everyone's personal situation. We are here to maintain a standard. If we allow one person to ignore the rules, where does it stop?" Then she looked at me, cold, precise, with the same fake politeness she always wore like perfume, and said, "Perhaps you should consider homeschooling your daughter. For her sake, and for everyone else's peace and comfort." That moment, that sentence broke something in me. She didn't just see Layla as a burden. She wanted her hidden, out of sight, silenced, erased, all in the name of rules. The harassment escalated from there. One day, I found HOA notices duct taped to the therapy swing. Another day, a photo was left in our mailbox, Layla sitting on the grass with a note, "Improper use of shared lawn space." We don't have shared lawn space. It was our own backyard. Neighbors began whispering. Some stopped waving when they passed. A few started parking farther away from our driveway, afraid that associating with us might attract Karen's wrath. I don't blame them. She had turned the neighborhood into a silent battlefield, and we were the enemy. But it wasn't just me she was after. It was Layla. Every fine, every complaint, every icy word, it was a message that she didn't belong, that she didn't fit, that she needed to go. I kept filing appeals. I contacted disability rights organizations. I started documenting everything, but the stress was unrelenting. I watched my daughter's light dim just a little more each day. She still smiled, still laughed, but she began to ask questions no 9-year-old should have to ask. Why doesn't Miss Karen like me? Am I not allowed to play? Should I stay inside more? I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn every letter she'd ever sent. But I smiled and told Layla she was perfect just the way she was, that some people just didn't understand. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Karen understood exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about violations. It was about erasure, the slow, calculated kind. And if she couldn't fine us into submission, she'd find another way to get rid of us. And that's exactly what she did. The day it happened, the sky was the kind of blue that made you forget the world could be cruel. Birds chirped, sprinklers clicked across trimmed lawns, and children played in the distance. I had just stepped out for 20 minutes, a quick trip to pick up Layla's seizure medication. I left her with her tablet and her dolls in our backyard, her happy place where she felt safe. where she was supposed to be safe. Earlier that week, Karen had filed a formal HOA complaint stating that Layla's toys and special equipment created visual disorder in communal sightlines. She was referring to the adaptive swing, the therapy ball, and even the sunshade we'd installed so Layla wouldn't overheat in her wheelchair. The HOA board, more like Karen's echo chamber, issued a notice that all non-compliant items had to be removed from outdoor areas within 3 days or fines would be escalated and legal action considered. I was furious, but I complied. I moved everything into our backyard shed, a simple wooden structure tucked in the corner, shaded by trees. Layla loved that shed. To her, it was a castle, a fort, a secret hideout. She'd play inside it for hours with her dolls, rearranging cushions and singing to herself. She called it her quiet clubhouse. That morning, after we'd moved her swing set and toys inside, she asked, "Can I play in the shed today while you're gone, Mama?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but only with the doors open, okay? And only for a little while." She smiled and gave me a thumbs up with her little fingers bent inwards the way they do, a sign of effort, not weakness. I left. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that while I was away, Karen had made her move. A neighbor later told me she saw Karen walking around our backyard with a clipboard and a tape measure, conducting an inspection, she said. Another neighbor saw her enter the shed. No one stopped her. Why would they? She was the HOA queen. And besides, she said she was helping ensure safety compliance. The exact timeline is still unclear, but at some point during her inspection, Layla must have been inside, tucked in the corner of the shed, playing with her dolls, humming a song, unaware that the woman who hated her existence was just feet away. Then the door was shut, locked. A padlock was found later, a brand new one. The shed had never had a lock before. Karen's fingerprints were never officially found on it. But everyone knew. And then the fire started. No one knows how. Maybe it was the old extension cord used to power the tiny fan Layla kept beside her. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it was just cruel fate. But smoke began to rise, thick and black, curling upward like a serpent. Neighbors noticed. Someone called 911. Fire trucks were dispatched. People gathered. They pointed. They murmured. But when the firefighters arrived and asked if anyone was inside, the HOA board member who greeted them, a man Karen often hosted dinner parties with, shook his head and said, "No, it's an empty utility shed. Just property stuff. No one goes in there." Layla was inside, trapped, locked in. She was screaming, muffled, high-pitched cries that no one wanted to believe they heard. One child, a neighbor's son, tugged at his father's arm and whispered, "I think I heard a girl." But the father said, "Karen said it's empty." I pulled into the street just as the second fire truck arrived. I saw the smoke. I dropped the bag of medication and ran. Something in me knew. I knew that it was her. I shoved through the crowd, tripped over a hose, scraped my knee on the pavement. I screamed her name, over and over. "Layla, Layla, baby." The firefighters tried to hold me back. I fought them like a woman possessed. I didn't care. I heard her. Faint but real. A cry. A desperate, cracked whisper. "Mama." I ran to the shed. It was hot to the touch. The handle scorched my palm. The door wouldn't open. I kicked, pounded, screamed. One of the firefighters finally came with a crowbar. It took 2 tries. The door flew open with a blast of smoke, choking in dark. And there she was, curled on the ground, barely conscious. Her hands were blistered. Her hair was damp with sweat and ash. Her lips moved, but no sound came. They pulled her out, her small body limp, her arms hanging like wilted branches. Paramedics rushed to her. Oxygen, ice packs, screams and radios. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I stroked her soot-covered cheeks. She opened her eyes just long enough to see me, then closed them again. She lived, barely. The paramedics told me later that had it been 5 minutes more, her oxygen levels would have dropped beyond revival. I stood there as they loaded her into the ambulance, my own body covered in ash and sweat, shaking. And then I heard the voice, Karen's voice, calm, unmoved, from behind the crowd. Her arms folded, Her lips curled ever so slightly. She said it like it was a simple observation, like it was weather or traffic. Well, that's one less burden for the neighborhood. I turned, eyes wild, blood boiling, but she was already walking away. No apology, no shock, no humanity. That child, that innocent, fragile, perfect soul, the one locked inside a burning shed, that was my daughter. And HOA Karen made sure she stayed inside. Smoke still lingered in the air the next morning, faint, bitter, clinging to the corners of the house like a cruel memory that refused to leave. Layla was in the hospital, sedated and hooked up to machines that beeped in quiet rhythm. Monitoring the breath, she almost didn't get a take. Her skin was pink from burns, her lungs inflamed from the smoke. I hadn't slept. I sat by her bedside all night, holding her hand, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. You're safe now. Mama's here. I won't let them hurt you again. But outside that hospital room, the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The very next day, I received an email from the HOA, cold, sterile, almost smug in its detachment. It stated that no liability shall be assumed by the Homeowners Association for accidents occurring on private property. That's how they described it, an accident. A child being locked inside a shed that then caught fire was apparently just an unfortunate fluke. No mention of the complaint Karen filed. No mention of the forced removal of the therapy equipment. No acknowledgement that the shed had never been locked until that day. I replied, instantly demanding answers. I asked who had entered my property. I asked why my daughter was left inside. I asked for an internal investigation. The reply came 2 days later. Short, sharp. The HOA is unaware of any unauthorized access or incident involving board members. Then came the real blow, Karen's statement to the police. She claimed she had never seen Layla on the property that day, that she had never entered the shed, that she had simply walked the perimeter for routine compliance and left. She said the padlock must have been installed by the homeowner. She even suggested, without saying it directly, that maybe I had been careless. Maybe I had locked the shed myself and forgotten. The officer assigned to the case looked uncomfortable when I pressed him. It's a hard situation, he said, eyes avoiding mine. There's no direct evidence of criminal intent, no security footage, and the child, well, she's not able to provide a clear verbal account. Layla's trauma had taken her voice. She wouldn't speak, just held my hand tighter every time someone in a uniform entered the room. I felt like I was drowning. I reached out to the neighbors. Some responded with tentative sympathy, sending flowers or messages that read more like disclaimers than comfort. We're so sorry for what happened. We hope Layla recovers quickly. Please don't involve us. We're praying for you. It's best not to stir things up. Karen can be complicated. But others avoided me completely, crossed the street when they saw me coming, pretended they didn't see the hospital wristband still wrapped around my arm. Only one neighbor, Maria, from 3 houses down, came to visit us in the hospital. She held my hand and cried. I saw her in the shed that day, she whispered, and I saw Karen near it. But I was afraid to say anything. My husband, he's on the board. That was it. That was the truth. Everyone knew. But no one wanted to be the first to step into the fire. No one wanted to risk Karen's retaliation. They'd seen what she could do. They'd seen the fines, the violations, the silent punishments. And now, they'd seen what she was willing to risk, even a child's life, to maintain control. And Karen? She remained unshaken. At the next HOA meeting just days after the fire, she sat at the front of the room like nothing had happened. She wore a navy dress, a pearl necklace, and a smile that chilled me to the bone. When someone asked about the incident, she brushed it off. The board has no role in private safety matters. Let's move on to landscaping updates. That was it. No accountability. No remorse. Just denial, clean, polished, and weaponized. I filed complaints. I hired a lawyer. I contacted the local press. I thought the truth would be enough. But truth isn't always louder than power. Not when it's up against a well-oiled machine of technicalities and legal language. Not when it's buried beneath the polite smile of a woman who knew how to wield the rulebook like a shield. I was exhausted, betrayed not just by Karen, but by a system built to protect people like her. I felt like I was shouting into a void while my daughter lay bruised by the silence. And yet, in the quiet moments by Layla's bedside, I found something else. Not hope, not yet, but fire. A slow-burning determination. Because if the HOA wouldn't admit the truth, if the neighbors wouldn't speak up, if the law wouldn't act, then I would. And Karen had no idea the kind of war a mother could wage once she had nothing left to lose. The night I brought Layla home from the hospital, I sat beside her bed and watched her sleep. Her chest rose and fell slowly, a little more steadily now. But the rawness in her throat meant she still couldn't speak above a whisper. Her body would heal in time, but her trust, her sense of safety, that had been scorched in ways no medicine could mend. That night I made a vow. No more letters. No more begging. No more silence. If I didn't fight for my daughter, who would? The next morning, I started collecting everything, every email, every HOA notice, every complaint. I opened a binder and labeled it Karen's War. I printed timestamps, photographs, and Karen's own words. I even pulled city code to compare what was actually law versus what Karen claimed was policy. I created a timeline, the fines, the inspections, the forced removals of Layla's equipment, the lock, the fire. Then I went deeper. I started knocking on doors. Gently, respectfully, I asked my neighbors if they had ever had issues with the HOA, or more specifically with Karen. At first, I was met with closed doors and awkward silences, but a few brave voices cracked through. A mother told me Karen had tried to ban her autistic son's sensory tent. An older couple said they were fined for installing a ramp for the husband's walker. A young man whispered that Karen had told him to paint over the pride flag on his mailbox or face fines for unapproved symbols. None of them had ever gone public. None had ever dared to push back. I started making copies. I highlighted patterns. I built a case, not just for Layla, but for all of us who had suffered under Karen's quiet cruelty. Still, I knew paperwork wasn't enough. I needed attention. That's when I reached out to Melanie Diaz, a local journalist who had once covered ADA violations in public schools. I emailed her everything. At first, she didn't respond. But 3 days later, she called. Her voice was quiet but intense. I read it all, she said. I don't think this is just an HOA story. This is a civil rights story. She came over that week with a camera crew and spent hours filming in our backyard. The shed, the charred wood, Layla's quiet gaze as she held her doll. Melanie interviewed me on the porch. I told her the truth, calmly, tearfully, but clearly. Within days, the story aired. Mother accuses HOA chair of negligence after fire injures disabled daughter. It spread like wildfire, ironically the very thing that nearly killed my daughter. After the news broke, something shifted. Neighbors who once stayed silent now called me. They shared their stories. Some even gave sworn statements. One woman anonymously emailed documents showing Karen had edited or deleted multiple HOA complaints from public records, complaints about her own decisions. I turned that over to my lawyer. Then I launched a community petition, not just for Karen's removal, but for a complete review of the HOA board's actions over the past 5 years. I set it up online and printed paper copies. I stood at the local grocery store, at the community park, at the school drop-off line. Within a week, we had over 400 signatures. Within 2, we had nearly 1,000. The HOA board couldn't ignore it anymore. Their next meeting was moved to the community center to accommodate the crowd. For the first time, people stood up, spoke out, shouted Karen's name, not in reverence, but in rage. They read aloud the list of violations, the patterns of discrimination, the negligence, the fire. Karen sat frozen. That perfect composure cracked just once, a twitch of her lips when someone yelled, "How many children have to get hurt before you step down?" The pressure mounted. The board promised an independent review. Karen was placed on temporary leave. But we all knew her era was ending. I hadn't just fought back. I had broken the silence. And for the first time in months, Layla looked at me with wide, glowing eyes and whispered, "You're my hero, Mama." That was all the justice I needed to keep going. But I wasn't done yet. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, creaky chairs, and a stiff silence that clung to every surface. But it might as well have been a battlefield. On one side sat my daughter, pale and fragile in her wheelchair, holding her favorite stuffed rabbit, the one that somehow survived the fire. On the other sat Karen Whitmore, calm and composed in a slate-gray blazer, her silver hair pinned into a perfect bun, a leather folder resting neatly on her lap like a weapon. She didn't look nervous. She didn't even look at me. Karen sat like she always had, confident, collected, and completely convinced of her own innocence. Her lawyer, a smug man in a navy suit, leaned in occasionally to whisper something. She nodded lightly, occasionally smiled, like this was all just an inconvenience she'd soon move past. But this wasn't an HOA meeting. This was a court of law. Our case, filed under State versus Whitmore, alleged criminal negligence and reckless endangerment of a disabled minor. My lawyer had warned me the burden of proof would be high. Karen hadn't left fingerprints on the padlock. She hadn't admitted anything in writing. The HOA board was already trying to distance itself, claiming Karen acted on her own outside protocol. But we had one thing no one expected: a video. The first 2 days of the trial were grueling. Witness testimonies. Karen's defense arguing that the fire was a tragic accident and that she had never even seen the child that day. Her lawyer painted her as a concerned citizen, just doing her duty. They emphasized her clean record, her years of community service, her spotless reputation. I sat still, listening, boiling inside, but I waited because I knew what was coming. On the third day, my lawyer called David Romero to the stand, the neighbor 2 houses down who had finally come forward. He had installed a new Ring security camera weeks before the incident, one that partially overlooked our shared backyard fence. We didn't even know it had caught anything until the footage was reviewed. The room went still as the clip played. There was Karen walking through my backyard, clipboard in hand. She stopped at the shed, looked around, opened the door, and then, without hesitation, she pulled out a small padlock from her bag, slipped it through the latch, snapped it shut, then turned and walked away. She didn't check if anyone was inside. She didn't knock. She just locked it and left. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. One juror put a hand over her mouth. Karen's lawyer stood immediately, objecting to incomplete context, but the judge allowed it. I turned to look at Karen. She wasn't composed anymore. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then to her lawyer, then to the floor. The courtroom silence was thick. No one dared speak. Even the bailiff leaned forward. The clip had only been 18 seconds long, but it changed everything. The prosecution leaned in. "Ms. Whitmore, can you tell the court why you locked a shed without checking if anyone was inside?" Karen's voice cracked for the first time. "I didn't know. I didn't think. I thought it was empty." But intent didn't matter anymore. The video shattered her entire narrative. Her defense was in pieces. In the closing arguments, my lawyer's voice was steady. This wasn't just about negligence. This was about control. About a woman who believed rules mattered more than people. A woman who saw a disabled child not as a neighbor to protect, but as an inconvenience to eliminate. She locked that door. And if this mother hadn't returned when she did, we'd be here for a funeral. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When the verdict was read, guilty on 2 counts, reckless endangerment and criminal negligence, I didn't cry. Not immediately. I just exhaled, a deep, shaking breath that felt like I hadn't taken it in months. Karen didn't look at me. She sat frozen, like the realization hadn't fully landed. Her sentencing would be decided later, but the conviction alone was enough. The judge turned toward the HOA's legal counsel next. Though not criminally liable, the court ruled that the HOA had acted with gross disregard for federal disability protections and levied a hefty civil penalty. They were ordered to pay damages along with the cost of Layla's medical care and emotional trauma. The court also issued an order requiring a complete internal audit and ADA compliance restructuring. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Flashes, microphones, shouting questions. I shielded Layla and whispered, "You don't have to say anything. You already spoke the loudest of all." That night, as the news story played across every local network, the headline read, HOA chair found guilty in shed fire that nearly killed disabled child. And in bold letters under her name, she nearly burned a child alive, all to protect her perfect neighborhood image. Layla is healing now. Slowly, painfully, but she's healing. The burns on her arms have faded into thin pink scars. Her hair is growing back in wispy curls, and every now and then, I catch her laughing again. It's softer than it used to be, more cautious, but it's laughter. And when she smiles, really smiles, I see light again, a light I feared was lost forever in smoke and ash. I often think about the shed, about how close I came to burying my only child, about how silence, not just Karen's, but everyone's, nearly cost her life. The silence of neighbors who looked away, the silence of board members who knew but did nothing, the silence of a system built to protect property lines instead of people. That kind of silence is lethal, and I'll never be quiet again. To every mother watching this, I want you to hear me. You are your child's fiercest protector. Even when the world tells you to stay quiet, to stop making waves, to follow the rules, remember that some rules were never meant to be followed. Not when they endanger the innocent, not when they turn safety into suffering. And to every neighbor in every community with an HOA or a board or a Karen of their own, pay attention. Power doesn't have to come with violence to be dangerous. It can come in the form of letters, fines, polite smiles hiding cruel intentions. You may not see the damage from the outside, but trust me, behind closed doors, it festers, until one day it burns. What happened to my daughter should never happen to anyone. And it didn't happen because of an accident. It happened because people were too afraid to speak and one woman was too obsessed with control. That's not just negligence. That's a failure of humanity. But we didn't stay broken. We rose. Because when I looked at my daughter lying in that hospital bed with her tiny hand wrapped around mine, I knew I couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. I fought back, not just for her, but for every child who's ever been treated like a problem and for every parent who's been made to feel powerless in the face of authority. I lost my trust. I nearly lost my daughter. But I found my voice. And now I'm using it. So no other mother ever has to go through what I did. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, made you think, made you feel something, then don't let it end here. Like, share and subscribe to this channel so more people hear stories that would otherwise be buried under silence. These aren't just tales from gated communities or petty disputes over grass height. These are stories of real families, real children, and real consequences when unchecked authority is left to rule without compassion. If you've ever seen injustice in your neighborhood, don't stay quiet. Speak up, record, report, stand beside those who are silenced, and remember, tyranny doesn't always show up with a badge. Sometimes it holds a clipboard and calls itself compliance. Don't ignore the small power that festers behind fences and bylaws. It only takes one voice to begin a movement. And if you're a parent, a neighbor, or someone who simply believes in doing what's right, your voice matters. Stand with us. Speak truth. Demand justice.